So, good morning, Dr. Huang. It's so great to have you here in our virtual newsroom. So, many of our audience are interested in Chinese economy. I think we are mostly amazed by the speed of its economy's growth in the past decades, but we also see those glaring distortions plaguing the system. So many of us are amazed by the economy, but we're also confused by it. And now we have a real expert in the room to help us understand the intricacies of the Chinese economy. Before we get started, Dr. Huang, can you introduce yourself a little bit and who you are, what's your specialization, and what are some of your current projects?
Okay. Thanks, Liz. It's great to meet you and to participate in this event. My name is Yukon Huang. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I've been there for about 10 years. Before that, I was the World Bank director for China and living in China for about 10 years. I specialize on China's economy, what's going on in China, its global implications, and in particular, relations with the United States. So I've been working most recently on issues of the U.S.-China trade tensions, issues about technology transfers, perceptions of Americans of China. How do you solve these kinds of frictions in the coming years? What's going to be different between Biden and Trump in terms of their policy proposals toward China? And can this actually be solved? So there's a range of concerns that I have.
Awesome. That's such an amazing introduction. And those are all areas of topics that we want to cover briefly in today's interview. But before we get started, there's this dual circulation strategy that has captured a lot of media buzz around it. It will certainly feature prominently in the next 5-year plan. But people have argued that, is it a sort of a backstep away from market-friendly reforms? What does it mean? So help us cut through the media buzz and understand the essence of the dual circulation strategy. What is it really about?
Well, the dual circulation strategy, first of all, we should realize it's not a plan. It's not a detailed framework for what China should do. I think of it as a thought process. Very simply, China is basically saying, the global environment is becoming more hostile. We have these trade pressures with the United States. We used to rely a lot on trade, foreign investment to spur growth, to get technology. And if that's going to be more difficult in the coming years, then we should start to rely a little bit more on domestic demand. But we shouldn't forget the fact that the world, the external economy, the external demand, if it's open and it's still favorable, it is in fact a more powerful force than some so-called domestic demand factors. So it's essentially saying, look at both aspects, the foreign sector, external sector, and the internal sector, and make use of what makes a lot of sense. But the dual circulation strategy has been, in my view, misinterpreted by many. When you focus on domestic demand, people instinctively think consumption, because China's consumption is ratio in terms of the size of its economy is relatively small. So people say, what this means is that we should promote or encourage more consumption. Now, the dual circulation strategy is not a short-term issue. It's a long-term issue. And in the long term, consumption does not drive growth. So you cannot actually grow faster by promoting or encouraging consumption. In fact, if you try hard, you reduce your growth rate. And that is because consumption comes from rapid growth. It doesn't cause rapid growth. So that's the first mistake people make. They think this somehow relates to consumption. It actually relates to investment. And that's surprising to some people because they already say, well, China invests a lot. So how can it be that this strategy talks about or should be focusing on investment as a major domestic growth driver? And the answer is, it's not the quantity of investment, it's the efficiency of investment, the returns to investment. And if you go back 10 years ago and you look at China's investment, the ratio size of GDP hasn't changed much, something between 40 to 45%. But the returns to investment at the overall level today in China is about half of what it was 10 years ago. So this decline in the returns to investment, the inefficiency, totally explains why China's growth has declined from 10% to 6%. So the challenge with the dual circulation strategy is, can I reverse this? Or at least can I stabilize this? Now, for some, it would say, well, this decline is natural. This is a maturing economy. It's an upper middle income country. Richer countries don't grow as rapidly as poorer countries. So it's natural that if you're investing so much, the returns to investment would slowly decline over time. That's a basic economic principle. But the issue in China is that decline is incredibly rapid, much faster than frankly, normal circumstances would dictate. So there's something going on in China that explains why investment returns have fallen so sharply. And here people actually miss it. They think it has something to do, well, there's a lot of waste and inefficiencies, distortions, and that's why the return on investment is falling more quickly. In fact, that decline is a deliberate policy. And why is that a deliberate policy? Well, the answer is that over the last 10 years, a very large percentage of the state's investment has been deliberately shifted toward the interior provinces, particularly the far west. So you're talking about Tibet, Xinjiang, Chongqing, Gansu, Ningxia, Guangxi. The returns to investment in the western provinces are 40% less than the returns to investment along the coast. So if you start shifting more of your investment to the interior provinces, your growth rate will fall. And this goes beyond the issue of investment efficiencies, distortions. So why are they doing this? Why are they putting more money in the interior? And the answer is one, poverty, because most of the China's poor are in the far west. Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, they had a very high priority to eliminate absolute poverty by the end of last year. And you pour more money, and what do you do with that money? You build infrastructure, roads, water treatment plants, transport systems, communication systems. So what happens? You have a 4-lane highway, for example, that runs from Shanghai to Xinjiang to the Central Asia. And by the time you get to Xinjiang, there's no traffic. That project generates very little returns. You have a highway across the Himalayas to Tibet. Again, very expensive. Economically, it doesn't make sense. You have cellular communication systems across all the mountains and deserts in the far west. Very few use because there's practically nobody there. Why did you build this? There's a security issue. China wants to be able to communicate everywhere. And you have 4-lane highways. Why is that? Because if you want to logistically move security people and others rapidly, you need this, but you don't need this regularly. The net result is very low returns. So that's the first part of the duel. When you talk about domestic demand, it's not consumption, it's investment, but it's not about increasing investment. It's about asking the question, why are my returns so low, and has China overdone it in terms of putting money into the far west? Then you look at the external sector, the so-called external focus of the duel. What is the issue here? Well, the first thing we should realize is trade. The trade surplus has never accounted for more than 10% of China's growth rate over the last 20 years. So it's actually never, in an accounting sense, been a growth driver. So when you're talking about whether you should actually use it to drive growth, it doesn't drive growth, actually, because your trade surplus is so small compared to everything else. It's the knowledge transfer that comes from trade and foreign investment that makes a difference. So on the external issue, it's not actually about trade per se, or the trade surpluses per se. It's about, can China continue to get what I call foreign knowledge and technology? And here's the key issue. China's been able to get that knowledge from abroad and use it better than any country we've ever seen. And that's a strange question. Why? Because that knowledge is actually available to everybody, to Russia, to India, to Brazil, to Indonesia. So how come China gets it and it makes better use of it in terms of promoting efficiency, production, new product lines, better than any country we've seen? So here's a very strange issue. What do our textbooks tell us? They tell us that if you want knowledge to be used efficiently and to be productive and to become more innovative, we should rely on market-based systems. Market-based systems promote innovation, entrepreneurship. Now, China is much more of a market-based system than it was 10 years ago, but relative to other countries, it's much more state-driven. So why is it that a state-driven economy, in terms of its interactions globally, is able to get access to knowledge and to use it far better than any other country? And here we missed the boat again. We don't really understand this issue. And it's actually very controversial. It's because as a state, a socialist economy, when knowledge flows into China from a foreign investment, where you buy some factory or something, where you exchange collaborative research, and it comes into China, it spills over in China. The spillover effect is multiples more than it is in other countries, because the social system makes that knowledge available widely. In a capitalist system, that knowledge is captured by a firm, And patent and IPR protection prevents it from leaking out to other firms. But in China, it gets spread. So now we have another great paradox, that socialist or state-driven systems are much better in disseminating knowledge than capitalist systems. And here it is. In knowledge in the US, if a firm has knowledge and has IPR protection and patents, it's very difficult for other firms to get it, or they have to invest a lot to get it. So we have a very other big controversy because the tension between the US and China, one part of it is the protection of knowledge. And that's accusing China of actually not having good IPR protection. But at the same time, that so-called, what I call weak system, that system in China which doesn't protect IPR, disseminates it more rapidly. And then you grow more rapidly, you get more jobs and higher wages. So essentially what you have in China today, a system where knowledge spreads, jobs are generated, wages increase. That's what America had 40, 50 years ago, when we did not have a strong IPR system, when knowledge among American companies was spread widely. Now that knowledge in America isn't spread widely. It's captured by IPOs in the stock markets. So you create an instant billionaire with knowledge in America. You don't create an instant billionaire in China with knowledge because that knowledge is not so protected, it gets spread. So the dual circulation strategy, in terms of the external issue, is this issue of how do I get foreign knowledge, or can I? And can I continue to rely on? And what do I do in terms of making it more widely used in China if there is a big issue about IPR protection? Now, these are very controversial issues, and these are all at the heart of the debate in terms of tensions. But what I generally write about is that most of the debate misses the point. They actually don't understand the issue because the issue is actually quite deep and very difficult to actually discern. Let me stop there. Talked a lot.
No worries. That's a terrific answer. And it's so interesting that you talk about this idea of sort of positive externalities created by knowledge that, from an economic point of view, when something has positive externality, there's actually a role for government to intervene and sort of reap the benefit of that technology. But the idea of IP protection, which is sort of from a legal point of view important, kind of goes against that. But you briefly alluded to this tension between US and China, which I think is really interesting. So next, I wanted to chat about this idea of decoupling a little bit, which is trumpeted by the Trump administration. The Trump administration, the last 4 years, kicked off this process of disintegrating U.S.-China capital markets and goods and services market. They did things like restrict, pension funds and local and state investment funds investing in China. So, talking about decoupling, when it's about sort of critical medical supplies or critical resources like rare earth that has use in defense, it's less controversial. But when it comes to capital market, it's actually a really contentious issue. So help us understand what is the long-term impact of financial decoupling, so to speak, and if there's legitimate national security concerns, as the U.S. government seems to believe, what's the right balance here between security concerns versus, unnecessary restrictions on capital markets?
You made a very interesting point. And since you're based in New York, right? So the financial centers and the financial flows are very, very important. Right. Let's go back a bit before I get into the financial decoupling. And let's start off and ask, what do we mean by decoupling? So America wants to sort of decouple from China. So decoupling means you're economically or financially integrated in some way, and you want to break or weaken those links. So what are those links? First, there are trade links. You export and import. There's foreign investment links. You invest in each other. There are financial links that you just mentioned, that money flows from the savers and institutions here and in China back and forth. There is what I call, very important, the knowledge link, the flow of academics, collaborative research. American and Chinese researchers, their collaboration in publication of joint papers, which makes it what I call international authorship, that's the largest in the world, larger than Britain and America or France and America. So now you're starting to separate the trade links, the foreign investment links, the financial links, the knowledge links. And then, of course, you have people-to-people exchanges, visas, tourism. This is all. And America has basically put in restrictions in every one of these areas. So when we get into the question of decoupling, we begin by asking, why? What is the concern? Okay? And let's just assume that let's start off with the concern. Is trade the concern? And let's think about what that means. 70, 80% of all the products in a store like Walmart comes from China. Are we going to say don't have those? If we did, we actually close Walmart down, okay? And then most of these things like faucets and toys and everything are non-consequential in any kind of a political sense. So in many ways, the broad area of decoupling trade doesn't make any much sense. What about foreign investment? Now, foreign investment, there is a security concern. You're worried about Chinese companies coming into the US and buying sensitive industries, okay? There is a review process for that. So actually, you can deal with that. You don't need to decouple. You just need to review it very carefully. And then let's focus very much on the financial. What is meant by financial links? It means the money is flowing from here to China and vice versa. Now, do you want to actually harm that, or you want to do something to stop that or impede that? Well, let's look at a very simple question. America borrows a lot. It runs a substantial trade deficit. It's had a trade deficit every year for 40 years. That means it has to cover that financially. And part of that is it sells bonds. Domestic borrowers buy those bonds, savers buy those bonds, but foreign savers buy those bonds, and China is among the largest. Actually, it fluctuates between China and Japan. So if you actually start to say, I don't want China to come in or their funding and want to decouple in that sense, you're essentially making it very difficult for America to run its budget deficits and its trade deficits. So that is a negative factor. Interest rates would soar, and that is certainly not something that's desirable. Now, what about American money going into China? So you prohibit Americans from putting their savings into Chinese equity markets or buying Chinese bonds. Now, what is there? Is there a security issue there? Not really. So if you restrict that, you're basically restricting the returns to American investors because the yields on financial instruments are much higher in China than US. So who are you actually hurting? You're basically hurting American savers, American pension funds, because they no longer can get high returns. And when you restrict this, can you fully restrict this? And the answer is you can't actually, because financial markets are very fluid. They leak all over the place. So even though America has serious restrictions on financial flows to China, American money into China has been increasing steadily. And it's been growing up a lot. So it's still going even with these restrictions. So I would basically say financial flows back and forth are not the issue. The real issue actually is knowledge. Because what really worries the so-called foreign policy establishment in the US is a security concern. And that security concern is really the issue of, will China become a technological power? And with that power being in a technological sense, threaten America's security interests? Now, I think that is a big issue out there. And it revolves around things like certain products, high-tech products are dual use. It can have a commercial purpose, but it could potentially have a military purpose. And then the issue then becomes, if I don't somehow restrict this and China becomes more powerful militarily, is that a threat to America? But then there's the economic aspect. If I basically cut off China's access to those high-tech products, what is the consequence on the United States? Well, the answer is that these companies, of which there are dozens and dozens who produce these high-tech products, 20 to 50% of their earnings come from selling to China. So if you stop it, they can't invest and grow. So here's the irony. The Defense Department put out a statement that restricting high-tech exports to China weakens America's ability to produce high-tech components needed to keep America's military strong. So even decoupling of high-tech may have a negative impact on China's, what I call military capacity, but it also has a negative impact on America's military capacity. In essence, decoupling is a very complicated issue. Much of the focus is in the wrong place, and we haven't figured out from a US perspective what is the right way to do it. In my view, there is actually certain measures that could be addressing what I call the security concerns without damaging the economic, but practically no one recognizes or understands this yet. Hopefully they'll get to that.
Great. Can you briefly talk about sort of your approach to this issue? What are some of the guidelines that you have in mind?
Well, if security is a concern, and here's the interesting issue. If you go back 10 years, and we talked about foreign investment, financial flows, economic issues were discussed separately. Security and political were separately. And there wasn't an issue. There wasn't what I call a contradiction. Okay. Now what's different today is that they are part of the same discussion. So when security concerns become a focus of attention with economic, it dominates. And that consequence is it becomes a zero-sum game. Because on security, if you worry about it, you prevent anything from happening. And that's the problem we have today. So what we need is an arrangement which actually deals with security concerns and economic concerns at the same time in a way that makes it a positive relationship rather than a negative relationship. We don't have that at the moment because we only have a discussion of what I call the security establishment. And what I call the economic business community hasn't been able to enter into this debate. That was the situation under Trump. So the issue for Biden is, can he do something on this? Then the question is, if we have a concern like this, do we have arrangements to deal with something like this? And the answer is we actually do. Take the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. We basically realize that nuclear bombs and military armament, the more you produce, it's costly, it's not good. But you worry about the other side. You don't trust the other side. The basic issue is you don't have trust. If you don't trust somebody, you're sort of scared about this. That's what we have in terms of this US-China security concern. So what you need actually is for high-tech investments in components and commodities where there's concern about cybersecurity, data security, information. You have to have an international agency with an inspection body to set standards and to provide that kind of assurances, just like we have on nuclear, that you can expect people's where they're building more bombs and where they're storing it. Are they doing something? Like the world's basically accepted that kind of monitoring system because neither side trusts the other side. And that's going to be the issue between US and China for a long time because as a democratic system here in the United States, we don't trust an authoritarian regime and we never will. We therefore have to have an international arrangement to do this. Now that's going to be a tough effort in terms of creating this. Can we actually do something very practical, though, that sort of like gets us by? Take Huawei. So America doesn't want Huawei to establish 5G telecommunications facilities in Europe and certainly not in the United States because we worry about the data leaking out, we worry about spying, et cetera, et cetera. How do you deal with this? And the answer is actually quite simple. You, for example, say, Huawei, partner with Nokia. Build a 5G system, have Nokia deal with the sensitive security information aspects to provide assurances to the Western interests that this is not a problem. Now think about what America was trying to do with TikTok. TikTok was under threat of being taken over or banned because of security concerns of the information being generated. So the proposal was that TikTok needs to partner with Oracle or Walmart so that the security aspects would be handled and guaranteed by a so-called trusted entity, not TikTok, okay? And that to me actually is a reasonable solution because how else can we deal with this trust element? We can't sort of like tell people to trust others, they won't. We have to have our own kind of systems that we trust or somebody else trusts. And you can actually apply this in a reverse fashion. There are many American companies who want to operate in China, internet digital companies. China restricts their entry or bans it on security grounds. So the US is basically saying this is not fair. Similarly, what we need, therefore, is a Chinese company to pair with a US company, whether you're talking about Google or Facebook or something else, so that the so-called security interests of both sides are dealt with. Okay? And that to me is the only way you can get around this because I don't see any other way of handling this. But the alternative, what is the alternative? The alternative is going to be decoupling, separation, and no one wins. So my feeling is you have to therefore deal with this on a paired basis. And if you can get over this hump.
Fascinating. So I wanted to move over and talk about international institutions a little bit. That's an area you have tremendous expertise in. So WTO as an international institution has been bashed by the Trump administration a lot, right? So, they talk about how China got tremendous perks and advantages from the WTO, and U.S. is not treated fairly. U.S. is badly represented, and the WTO is basically unfair to the U.S. How would you assess the Trump administration's stance on international institutions like WTO? And we remember, in 2019, the US and the EU rejected China's market economy status since, Chinese commodities and, steel and aluminum were, heavily underpriced, and, there's subsidies going on due to, state-backed oversupply and stuff like that. So how should we understand WTO and its relation with US and China? Is there something going on?
Well, Trump's focus on international agencies were essentially didn't want them. And he did not favor multilateralism. He did not favor international institutions of any form. Why is that? And is Biden going to be any different? Well, let's go back to what drove Trump's policies right from the start. His biggest issue was trade deficits and trade deficit with China. And he looked at trade deficits as a bilateral issue. China, you have a huge trade surplus with me. I have a huge deficit with you. If I can somehow eliminate it or moderate it, my trade problems will be a lot easier to deal with. So I deal with you, and I deal with South Korea, I deal with Europe. I deal with that as a bilateral issue. And therefore, what do I need a WTO for? Because WTO is talking about global multilateral arrangements. Okay, it's not really talking about bilateral deals. So his view of international agencies is essentially established by what I call bilateral economic relationship. So the first question is, does this make any sense? Does this make any sense? Do you focus on trade in a bilateral way? And the answer is no, because trade is not a bilateral issue. It's a multilateral issue. And the issue is very easy, for example. Suppose, for example, as a consumer, you have a huge debt to Amazon because you buy everything from Amazon and you owe Amazon a lot. But if you get into a financial problem, is your problem with Amazon? Not really, because those products are not made by Amazon. They're made by everybody over the world. Your problem is you're overspending somehow. It just shows up as with Amazon. Similarly with China, because all that stuff coming from China, a lot of it is produced substantially elsewhere. It's not a bilateral issue, it's a multilateral issue. So if one realizes that trade is not bilateral, and America has a bilateral trade deficit with 90 countries, okay, it can't be solved. It's the overall issue. And then if it becomes an overall multilateral problem, then you naturally then say, I need an overall multilateral institution. WTO is the place to deal with it. So that's the first issue. And now Biden is a multilateralist. So he will revive and deal with WTO. So then you go back, okay, I got WTO. I have an issue like dumping. I have an issue like subsidies. I have an issue about China as a state-driven economy. And I want WTO to somehow get into this. We have a problem. And the problem we have is that the powers and regulations governing WTO don't deal with these issues with a degree of accuracy. Or if they do, the proposals don't make much sense. Let me give you a very simple, obvious one. There is a lawsuit about Airbus being subsidized by European governments, and that Boeing is being subsidized by America through defense contracts. Now, if one looks very deeply, it's true. Boeing's fixed costs are largely covered by its defense contracts. So when it produces commercial aircraft, it only has to cover the variable costs, the running costs. Airbus doesn't have Europeans don't have a huge defense industry. So they don't subsidize Airbus through defense contracts. They subsidize through government subsidies. So both nations subsidize. Now here it is, China subsidizes. Everybody subsidizes, but they do it differently. Okay? So the issue is not that China subsidizes. Everybody does. The issue is the way they subsidize. So let's look at China and look at America in terms of subsidies. In America, if we want to subsidize company or households, let's say to use green technologies, battery-powered cars, or geothermal heating systems, we give tax subsidies, write-offs through the budget to subsidize the activity because it has externalities. So let's go to China. If it wants to subsidize something, It can't do it through budgets or tax write-offs. Most Chinese don't pay taxes. And the system's not sophisticated enough to get into company books to figure out depreciation and everything else. So it ends up subsidizing through banks. So here's the issue. China subsidizes through banks. America subsidizes through budgets. But they both subsidize. So now we have a trade war or an economic war, which talks about unfair subsidies. It's not actually about unfair subsidies. It's about the fact that we all subsidize, but we do it differently. And WTO can't deal with this. You talked about dumping in China, a market economy. Take the example about steel. So you go back for a number of years, the world is saying China is exporting too much steel. Prices are too low. It's a state-driven economy. This is unfair. It's dumping. And then if it's not a market-driven economy, you can apply penalties which are very severe. So that's why China is quite unhappy in terms of being declared a non-market economy, because it allows the penalties to be much more severe than normal. So then, technically speaking, is China dumping steel? Let's look at the similar analogy in a US context. So you go to a department store on New Year's Eve or whatever, and there's a big sale. And you go to outlet stores and you see huge amounts of something, and the price is really low. It's way below cost. Is that dumping? Not really. We just consider it getting rid of the inventory. Somebody's selling everything, and it's clearly below what it cost them. But if they keep it, the losses are even greater. And we don't think there's anything wrong with this, actually. Okay? So, but suppose that person was doing this every single day. We then have a problem. We actually have laws which say you cannot have these kinds of sales prices forever because it's too low. So that's the issue. Not that the price is low at this moment in time and there's a huge amount. It's that it's perpetually low, that you are selling this perpetually. That is dumping. And then let's go back to steel. China exports and is a major steel exporter. But if you look at exports of steel over the last 15 years, it's been as low as 5 million tons, as high as 30 million. It's in fact incredibly cyclical. So during the period when there was a lot of China's steel being exported, it was very, very high. But within a year or two, it fell 50, 60%. So that so-called dumping period didn't stay there forever. And so the reality is China's production and exports of steel is not perpetually high or wiping out the market. It fluctuates dramatically by huge amounts. In that sense, it's no different from corn. If our farmers sell all their excess soybeans because they got too much and they sell it at a very low price, we don't call that dumping. We just basically say the market is pretty bad. People have too much corn. They have to get rid of it. So a lot of what we accuse, we don't actually look at the issue. If there's perpetual production of steel at a high level forever, and it's being sustained by government subsidies, then this is a violation. But that's actually not the case in China, because its production actually varies. It's reducing its capacity because it really cannot afford to sell steel overseas at a low price for long periods of time. Now prices of steel have soared. China needs a lot of steel. It has to import a lot of steel. It doesn't have the capacity for all its needs. So this is the kind of a problem we face. We don't actually fully look at what's happening to understand this issue. Now, so questions like subsidies, we have an issue. The issue goes back to what are subsidies? And why is it different in every country? And then if we can figure it out, is this a problem or not? And the same thing is true for state-owned enterprises, for example. State-owned enterprises in China, the numbers and the amounts they invest have soared in the last 5 years. So from a Western perspective, there's a concern that the state is rising, that enterprises, state-supported enterprises in China are becoming much more important, and this is a threat to the world or the world trade. Again, people totally misunderstand it. This increase in state-owned enterprise investments, they are not actually what I would call commercial companies producing steel or electronics or textiles. These are actually specialized agencies of local governments. In China, they call them local government financing vehicles. They borrow and they invest in infrastructure, roads, water supply, sewage system. But formally in the books, they are recorded as state enterprises, state-owned enterprises. So what is really happening in China is surging investments of local governments in social infrastructure, which has really very little to do with what I call global trade tensions. Okay? But we think it is because it looks like the SOEs are rising in China. And you have this storyline that Xi Jinping is promoting the rise of state enterprises. Actually, what's happening, it has nothing to do with Beijing or the central government. It's the local provinces in the far west and the central areas building more roads and sewage systems and et cetera, and that's social infrastructure. And that's what we need in the US. Biden wants to increase social infrastructure. And when he does it, it shows up as investments of local governments, but it doesn't show up as investments of companies. But in China, they show up as investments of companies. So again, the so-called political tensions misunderstand something which is completely different from the reality. And this is what we have in terms of WTO and these kind of international agencies. They have a tough problem of trying to sort out the fact that different systems and the information being generated have different implications. And unless you understand that, it's difficult to deal with. When Trump talked about WTO and China joining WTO, he basically complained about the fact that China got privileges as a developing country. And this is unfair because it's so rich. It really isn't. And the reality is it didn't join as a developing country. It's the only country that joined with a so-called WTO plus and an annex. It's the only country. An annex has special conditions which were more onerous than other countries. So actually it joined not with favorable terms or more favorable terms. It actually joined with less favorable terms than other countries. But very few people realize it. They somehow think China took advantage of WTO, that it had these so-called flexible terms because it was a developing country. China, in fact, waived the privileges of the benefits of a developing country when it joined. It accepted, in fact, more onerous burden.
I see. Fascinating. It strikes me as so interesting because lots of the policies, that seems to be reasonable at face value are actually guided by misunderstanding of how China's economy actually works. So, final question of the day. If you were to advise the Biden administration on its next 4 years China economic policy, what are some of the concrete steps you would propose to the Biden administration to help it repair, the U.S.-China economic relations, which have been tumultuous for the past 4 years?
What is Biden proposing? He's proposing that America needs to be more competitive. And he's focusing on that domestic competition, education systems, infrastructure. And that makes a lot of sense. Give support to the industries, and et cetera. He's favoring multilateral and building alliances. And again, that's different from Trump, and that makes a lot of sense. And China favors multilateral approaches. It favors WTO. It favors global agreements. So there's a shared interest in that. And China realizes it's in their own interest that America becomes economically more competitive. So I don't think there's any problem in there. It's the third kind of a proposal that Biden has, which remains to be defined. So Biden has a proposal called a foreign policy for the middle class Americans. Okay? And that policy is not very clear because exactly what does that mean in terms of policies in terms of dealing with China? And many people think it does because they think of the fact, well, the problem is that the middle class in America has suffered in terms of job losses and stagnant wages from the rise of China. And therefore, the issue would be, if I can slow China's rise, maybe this will help the middle class in America. And if you take it one step further, it's interpreted as being, we need more manufacturing jobs, middle class in the Midwest, Ohio, because the surveys which this strategy was based upon were done in places like Kansas, Missouri, Ohio, and surveyed the middle class. And a lot of these areas, the issue was manufacturing jobs have disappeared. And then the issue is this a China problem? Now, I think the issue is complicated. Certainly, China's rise as a manufacturing power accelerated change in manufacturing in the US and other countries. Okay? But that change would have occurred regardless of whether China had been on the scene. And it basically shows up in terms of how many people in the US are employed in manufacturing. And the answer is 9%. 91% of Americans are in services, are in industry. And that 9% is a steady decline from 30 to 50 years ago. So employment in manufacturing in the US has been declining steadily for decades and decades, way before China became what I call a major industrial power. So that decline has nothing to do with China in a fundamental sense. It relates essentially to the structure of economies as they go from low to middle to high income. And you can't change that. So I think the first issue that people are going to have to realize is a middle-class strategy, if it relates to China, doesn't actually have anything to do with industrial production. It has to do with higher paying service jobs for the middle class. Okay. And then the issue will be how kind of policies and to what extent do these policies have anything to do with China as opposed to what they have to do with America's own structure. Okay. If you go back to US universities and today, and you look at what I call the strong students, what are they studying? And you look at what they were doing 30, 40 years ago. And the first thing you realize is students today go a lot into business, manufacturing, digital, internet, finance, because that's where the jobs, high paying jobs are. If you go back 30, 40 years ago, they were going into engineering, chemistry, manufacturing activities. Okay. So that has really nothing to do with China. It has to do with the fact that students and academics and researchers, they will go into the areas where they see that this is growing or economically attractive. And it's not manufacturing. So one key issue will be the debate between, is China an issue? Is manufacturing the concern? What are services? How do you deal with this? Then the question will be, is a rapidly growing China, if it's rapidly growing, and a technologically more proficient China, good or bad for America? Okay. And the answer from an economic viewpoint is there is no reason why it shouldn't be a positive relationship. You'll have a technologically advanced Europe, who is America's major trading partner, but no one sees that trading relationship is bad for America. And in fact, when you look at the structure, what do you see? You see that actually the Europe, America, the product composition of what they produce is quite different. Europe produces, in fact, all the high-end consumer goods that America wants, the fashions and everything else, okay? They do not have the agricultural strength that America has. So America produces all these agricultural. Europe does not have Facebook, Amazons, Googles, all the digital giants. That is all in America, okay? So there's something about the American economy that produces all these agricultural, all these high-tech digital services, these financial services, and Europe produces all these consumer, fashion, design, mechanical, machine, whatever it is. Similarly, there's the same kind of structural difference. Now, once we realize that US structure of the economy, China's structure of its economy, European structure of the economy, they're actually quite complementary, okay? So that the trade relationships can actually be beneficial. Now, I'll just give you a very simple example. American companies invest $100 billion a year overseas. So when Trump came in 4 or 5 years ago, he said, American companies, you're investing too much overseas. You should invest more here in the United States. More jobs are created. You're investing too much in China, and you're creating jobs there, and then they export the products. It's very, very bad. So I always say to people, what percent of America's foreign investment, what percent of America's foreign investment goes into China of that 100 billion? And people think, well, it's huge, it's too much, we need to cut it back. And so they say, well, 15%, 20% maybe. The answer is 1%. Only 1% of America's foreign investment goes to China. Now, Europe, same size as America, invests multiples more. So why do European companies invest in China, but American companies do not? And this is very strange. So the Trump question is actually quite different. It's not that American companies invest too much in China. It's that American companies invest too little in China. Okay? And then the issue is very clear. China's barriers to foreign investment are much more geared towards services, preventing it from coming in, than manufacturing. And America's strength is services. European strength is manufacturing. So if you go to China and you walk through the malls, all the companies are European. There are practically no American retail outlets there. They're all European. Okay. And you go on the streets, they're all European cars. Okay. All right. So here's the issue from America point. If we have a problem with China, unfair trade competition, it's trade and services. And that's America's strengths. And I point this out because when you pick up the debate here, it's really that. It's always about manufacturing, unfair, this kind of low labor costs. Okay. So the issue, therefore, for Biden, in my view, if people understand the nature of the problem, understand the nature of the differences in the economy, how do you get more markets for America's service providers, particularly at the high end? And here there are serious restrictions on the China side. And so I think reciprocity, equal access should be a large focus of the discussions, not decoupling, but basically saying you have open markets here in various areas. You don't allow us to operate in various areas. You may have security or sensitive or political concerns. Let's figure out an arrangement so that you are comfortable, but American companies have better access. And so I go through this long discussion because when we have these tensions and we have a new administration, the problem, even whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, the emphasis tends to be in the wrong area because we have these preconceived notions about what the problem is. The problem is actually quite different. And once we realize it's quite different, then we have to look at a China problem in that context. And when you start looking at it in that context, it actually becomes more solvable. Because if you look at it as a manufacturing issue, it's not solvable. It's not solvable because it can't be solved. And then you blame China for something which can't be solved and which they really have very little to do with it. So this is what I see as the fundamental issue. When we talk about the fact that there's a problem between the United States and China, and it's economic and trade and investment or whatever, there's a huge amount of emotions, politics, ideology that makes it very difficult for someone to focus on what I call the technical reality of the issue. It's so clouded by these emotions. And we don't have that with other countries. So it's easier in some ways to deal with other countries because you don't have this kind of a tension, emotional tension that clouds the debate. But with China, that emotion is overriding. And that I think is the real challenge for Biden. Can he get over this or around this kind of emotional issue? And that emotional issue is not just a Republican issue, it's a Democratic. The Democrats are probably even more emotional about this issue. So this is a huge issue, I think, that Biden has to deal with. Let me stop.
I see. Thank you so much for all your insights. It's such a helpful conversation, and we will make sure to invite you back at some point in the future to talk even more about Chinese economy, because I'm sure there are lots of problems that we'll need your insights on. But thank you so much, Dr. Huang. Thank you. This has been terrific. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.